I was 19 years old when I landed on Betio Island in November of 1943, carrying 70 pounds of equipment and a weapon that would change me forever in ways I'm still trying to understand 8 decades later. My name was Private First Class William Morrison, and I'd been assigned as a flamethrower operator with the 2nd Marine Division, which at the time felt like being handed a death sentence with a pat on the back and a good luck. The M1A1 flamethrower weighed about 70 pounds fully loaded, and every guy who carried one knew he had a giant target painted on his back because the Japanese would do anything to take out a flamethrower before it reached their positions. The crossing to Tarawa was rough, and most of us were sick before we even saw the island, but that nausea was nothing compared to what hit us when we finally caught sight of Betio through the smoke and haze. The island was maybe 3 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point, flat as a board and covered with palm trees that were already being shredded by the naval bombardment that had been going on since dawn. We'd been told the bombing would soften them up, that the Japanese wouldn't have anything left to fight with, but I learned real quick that intelligence officers don't have to be the ones climbing over the reef while machine gun fire turns the water white around them. My squad leader was Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a guy from Pittsburgh who'd been at Guadalcanal and had this way of looking at you that made you understand he'd already seen more horror than you could imagine, and was still here anyway. He pulled me aside the night before the assault and said something I'll never forget. "Morrison, when you light that thing up, you commit. No half measures, no hesitation. You squeeze that trigger, and you hold it down until the job's done, because if you don't, they'll kill everyone around you. And afterwards, you're going to want to forget what you saw, but you won't. Ever. So you make peace with that now, or you don't make it off that beach." The landing was chaos from the moment our Higgins boat dropped the ramp. We'd been told the tide would be high enough for the boats to make it over the reef, but somebody miscalculated or lied, or just didn't care, because we grounded out about 500 yards from shore and had to wade in. The water was chest deep and warm like bathwater, and men were dropping before they made it 10 steps. I saw the guy in front of me just disappear under the surface, the water turning red around where he'd been standing, and I kept moving because stopping meant dying, and there was nowhere else to go but forward toward that beach. I made it to a seawall made of coral and coconut logs, dropped down behind it with maybe 20 other Marines, all of us trying to breathe and figure out what the hell we were supposed to do next. The flamethrower tanks had taken some shrapnel during the wade-in, and I was terrified they'd been punctured, but Kowalski checked them over and gave me a nod that meant they were still good. Above us, the Japanese were in fortified positions made of reinforced concrete and coral, built so solid that the days of naval bombardment had barely scratched them. We could hear them up there shouting commands and setting up fields of fire, and I knew that when we went over that wall, a lot of us weren't coming back. The battle for Tarawa lasted 76 hours, and every single one of those hours felt like a year. The heat was unbearable, pushing past 100 degrees, and between the sun and the flamethrower fuel sloshing on my back, I was cooking inside my uniform. The smell was something I can still conjure up if I let myself remember it. A mixture of cordite and burning palm oil, diesel fuel and human waste, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of bodies decomposing in the tropical heat. We'd lost hundreds of men in the first few hours alone, and there was nowhere to bury them, so they just lay where they fell while we fought around them. My first time using the flamethrower was against a Japanese pillbox on the 2nd day. Kowalski pointed it out to me, a concrete bunker with a machine gun port no bigger than a mail slot, and told me to get up there and burn them out because rifle fire wasn't doing a damn thing. I crawled forward with 2 other Marines covering me, dragging that 70 pounds of death on my back, and when I got within range, I flipped the igniter and squeezed the trigger. The stream of fire that came out was orange and black and white all at once, and it hit that bunker opening like the breath of hell itself. The screaming started immediately, high-pitched and inhuman, and it went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds before it stopped. When we checked the bunker later, there were 6 Japanese soldiers inside, or what was left of them, and I threw up right there even though I had nothing in my stomach. Kowalski found me afterwards and didn't say anything about it, just handed me his canteen and waited while I got myself together. "Gets easier," he said, but I could tell from his eyes that he was lying, or maybe he just hoped he was telling the truth. The thing about using a flamethrower is that it's not like shooting someone. With a rifle, there's distance, There's a split second where the bullet does the work and you can almost pretend you're not responsible for every detail of what happens next. But with fire, you're connected to it. You're pouring it out of your hands, directing it, watching it do exactly what you intended it to do, and there's no pretending you're not the one making it happen. By the third day, we'd pushed inland maybe 500 yards, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that every foot of ground cost blood. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had bragged that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years, and for a while there I thought he might be right. Their defensive positions were brilliant in a terrible way, mutually supporting fields of fire, reinforced bunkers connected by tunnels, and troops who would rather die than surrender. We'd been told that the Japanese believed surrender was shameful, that they'd fight to the death, but knowing it intellectually is different from watching it happen over and over again. I'd burned out maybe 15 or 20 bunkers by then, and each one added another layer to the thing that was building inside me, this weight that had nothing to do with the fuel tanks on my back. The other guys in the squad had started looking at me different. Not hostile exactly, but like I was necessary but contaminated, like I was useful but they didn't want to get too close. Nobody wants to think too hard about what a flamethrower does to a human being, and I was a walking reminder of exactly that. I'd volunteered for this job because I thought it would keep me useful, keep me alive, but I was starting to understand that some ways of staying alive aren't worth the cost. On the night of November 22nd, we'd secured a position about 800 yards inland, near what we were calling Red Beach 2. The Japanese had been pushed back to the eastern end of the island, and we knew they were running out of options, running out of supplies, running out of everything except the willingness to die. Kowalski had been monitoring the radio traffic, and he came over to where I was trying to clean the flamethrower nozzle. "Intelligence says they might try something tonight," he said quietly. "Banzai charge, probably. If they do, they'll throw everything they have left at us, and they'll be aiming for positions like this one because we're advanced. You good to go if it happens?" I told him I was, even though I wasn't sure what good to go meant anymore. My hands were steady enough and the flamethrower was functional, but inside I felt like something had been scraped hollow. We set up a defensive perimeter with about 30 Marines, dug in as best we could in the coral sand, and waited. The moon was nearly full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, and the island was quiet in a way that felt wrong, like the air was holding its breath before something terrible happened. Around 300 hours, it started. First came the shouting, this coordinated war cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and then they were coming at us out of the darkness, dozens of them, maybe more than 100 Japanese soldiers, in what had to be one of their final organized assaults. They had rifles and bayonets, grenades and swords, and they were running straight at our position, with the kind of desperate courage that comes from knowing you're already dead, and just want to take as many of the enemy with you as possible. Our machine guns opened up immediately, the 30 caliber Brownings cutting through them, but they kept coming, stepping over their own dead, and I knew we were about to be overrun. Kowalski was screaming orders, positioning Marines to cover the flanks, and then he was next to me, his hand on my shoulder. "Morrison, light them up, now!" I stood up from behind the coral berm we'd been using for cover, brought the flamethrower nozzle up, and squeezed the trigger. The stream of fire shot out maybe 40 yards, arcing through the air and landing right in the middle of the charging Japanese soldiers. The napalm mixture stuck to everything it touched, to uniforms and skin and weapons, and within seconds I was looking at running shapes made entirely of flame, human beings turned into torches, and still they came forward, some of them on fire, and still trying to reach us with bayonets or grenades. I swept the stream left and right, creating a wall of fire between us and them, and the screaming was unlike anything I'd ever heard or have heard since. It wasn't just pain. It was beyond pain. It was the sound of everything human being burned away, and I was the one doing it. Some of them dropped immediately, others ran in circles or staggered forward a few more steps before collapsing, and the smell of burning flesh mixed with the petroleum stench of the napalm created something so awful that I was breathing it in with every breath and knowing I'd never be clean of it. The M1A1 held about 4 gallons of fuel mixture, good for about 10 seconds of continuous fire, and I burned through the entire load in that first burst, creating an inferno that lit up the night like daylight. I dropped down to reload, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the valves, while the rest of the squad kept firing. The Japanese charge faltered when they hit that wall of fire, but they didn't stop completely. Some of them tried to go around, others tried to go through, and I could see shapes in the flames, silhouettes of men dying in the worst way human beings can die. Kowalski was still directing fire, calling out targets, and I got the second fuel tank connected and stood up again. "Left flank," he shouted, and I turned and saw another group of maybe 20 Japanese soldiers trying to come around the side of our position. I lit them up. That's the phrase we used, light them up. Like we were talking about cigarettes or a campfire and not human beings burning alive. The second burst caught them in a cluster, and the napalm spread from man to man like it was alive, seeking out anything it could burn. I watched one soldier, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, probably younger than me, running with his entire upper body on fire. His arms stretched out in front of him like he was trying to grab onto something that could make it stop, and then he just folded up and fell and stopped moving. I did that, I made that happen. That's what I tell myself when I wake up at 3 in the morning, even now, 80 years later. I did that, and I'd do it again because if I hadn't, he would have killed my friends, killed me. And that's the thing about war that nobody can explain to you before you live it. The charge broke after maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Japanese soldiers who were still alive pulled back into the darkness, leaving maybe 60 or 70 bodies in front of our position. Many of them burned so badly they didn't look human anymore. The fire from the napalm kept burning for another 20 minutes, feeding on palm fronds and wooden debris, and we just sat there in our positions watching it, nobody saying anything because what was there to say? We'd held the line, we'd survived, and the cost was written in fire and ash across the coral sand in front of us. When dawn came, I could see the full extent of what had happened. The bodies were scattered across maybe 100 yards of ground, some of them still smoking, and the smell was indescribable. We had to clear the area, had to check every body to make sure they were actually dead and not just wounded and waiting for a chance to take one of us with them. And that meant walking among what I'd created. I stepped over men who'd been burned down to nothing but charred bone and ash, past others who were recognizable as human but barely, and every single one of them was because of me, because of the weapon I'd been carrying and the trigger I'd squeezed. Kowalski found me later that morning, sitting by myself and staring at the flamethrower tanks like they were something alien that I'd never seen before. "You saved us," he said. "That charge would have overrun us if you hadn't done what you did. Every man in this squad is alive because of you." I nodded, but I didn't feel like I'd saved anyone. I felt like I'd crossed a line that you can't uncross, done something that marked me permanently, and no amount of tactical necessity or survival justification was going to change that. The flamethrower had been effective, brutally effective, but effectiveness isn't the same thing as right, and I was starting to understand that there are things you can do in war that are necessary and still unforgivable. The battle for Tarawa ended the next day, when the last Japanese positions were overrun. Of the approximately 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 were captured alive. The rest died fighting, and many of them died in ways that I made happen. We'd lost over 1,000 Marines killed, and more than twice that wounded in just 76 hours of fighting for a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of and would forget about within a year. But I'll never forget it. Never forget the smell or the sounds or the sight of men burning, because I pointed a nozzle at them and squeezed a trigger. When we shipped out after the battle, I was recommended for a Bronze Star for my actions during the Banzai charge. I never went to pick it up. What was I supposed to do, pin a medal on my chest and feel proud that I'd efficiently immolated 100 human beings? The citation said I'd shown extraordinary heroism in the face of the enemy, but heroism is supposed to feel like something noble, something you can look back on with pride, and all I felt was sick and hollow, and like I'd left something essential about myself burning on that beach. They tried to keep me on as a flamethrower operator for the rest of the war. I'd proven I could do the job, proven I wouldn't freeze up when it mattered, and trained flamethrower operators were valuable, because so many of them got killed before they could gain much experience. But I told them no. Told my company commander that I'd carry a rifle, run ammunition, dig latrines, do any job they wanted, but I was done with the flamethrower. He argued with me, told me I was one of the best they had, that I'd saved lives at Tarawa and could save more in the future, but I held firm. Eventually they reassigned me to a rifle squad, and I spent the rest of the war doing regular infantry work, which was dangerous enough but at least didn't require me to burn people alive. I made it through the rest of the war without major injury, fought at Saipan and Tinian, was there when we raised the flag on Iwo Jima, though I wasn't in the famous photograph, but Tarawa was the thing that defined my war, the thing that defined me. When I came home in 1946, I was 22 years old and felt like I was ancient, like I'd lived 100 years in those 3 years overseas. My family threw a welcome home party. Neighbors came by to shake my hand and thank me for my service, and I smiled and accepted their thanks, and felt like a fraud, because heroes aren't supposed to wake up screaming from nightmares about the sounds men make when they're burning to death. I tried to talk about it once with my father, a few months after I got back. He'd been in the First World War, fought at Belleau Wood, and I thought maybe he'd understand. I told him about Tarawa, about the Flamethrower, about the Banzai charge, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Son, some things you do in war, you can't talk about and you can't forget, and you can't let them define you even though they will anyway. You did what you had to do to survive, and your buddies survived because of it, and that's going to have to be enough." It wasn't enough, but I understood what he meant. There was no absolution coming, no moment where someone would tell me it was all okay and I could stop feeling guilty. I just had to carry it, and I've been carrying it ever since. The nightmares were bad for the first 10 years, then they faded to maybe once a month, then less. I got married in 1949 to a woman named Sarah, who I'd known in high school, and I told her before we got married that I'd done things in the war that I couldn't talk about and that sometimes I had bad dreams. She said she could live with that, and she did, for 56 years until she passed in 2005. I never told her the details, never described what I'd done with that flamethrower, because how do you explain to someone you love that you're capable of that kind of violence? How do you tell your wife that sometimes, when you're cooking on the grill or lighting a fire in the fireplace, you flash back to the sight of human beings burning and the knowledge that you made it happen? I had 3 kids, worked as a machinist for 37 years, coached Little League, went to church on Sundays, did all the normal things that normal people do. But I was never quite normal, never quite like everyone else, because I carried Tarawa with me everywhere I went. My oldest son asked me once about the war when he was about 15, asked if I'd killed anyone. I told him yes, I had, and that it wasn't something I wanted to talk about. He pressed a little, like teenagers do, and I finally said, "I did things that were necessary and I'll never know if they were right, and that's all I'm going to say about it." He never asked again. The VA diagnosed me with what they now call PTSD in the 1980s, though back when I first came home they called it shell shock or combat fatigue, or just being weak. I went to a few group therapy sessions with other veterans, sat in circles while guys talked about their experiences, but I never shared the details of what I'd done at Tarawa. I talked around it, talked about being afraid and watching friends die and the general horror of combat, but I never said, "I burned 100 men alive with a flamethrower and I can still hear them screaming." Some things you keep to yourself, not because you're ashamed exactly, though maybe shame is part of it, but because speaking it out loud makes it too real, too present, and you need it to stay buried most of the time, just to function. I've been back to Tarawa once in 1995 for a 50th anniversary ceremony. The island looked different, more developed, with actual buildings and roads, but the bones of it were the same. I found the area where our position had been that night, where the Banzai charge happened, and I stood there for a long time just looking at the ground. There's a memorial there now, listing the names of the Marines who died, and nearby there's a Japanese memorial for their soldiers. I read some of the Japanese names, tried to imagine them as 19 or 20-year-old kids like I'd been, tried to feel something other than the complicated knot of guilt and justification and sorrow that I'd been carrying for 50 years. I'm not sure it helped, but I felt like I owed it to them to come back, to acknowledge what had happened there, to stand on the ground where they'd died, and admit that I'd been the one who killed them. There are a lot of debates about the use of flamethrowers in war, about whether they're inhumane weapons that should be banned, about whether the suffering they cause is disproportionate to their military effectiveness. I've read articles about it, seen historians debate it, and I understand both sides of the argument. What I can tell you is that from the perspective of someone who actually used one in combat, they're effective beyond anything you can imagine, And that effectiveness comes at a cost that the person carrying that weapon will pay for the rest of their life. The Geneva Conventions eventually restricted their use, and I'm glad. But it doesn't change what happened at Tarawa, doesn't change the fact that on one night in November of 1943, I turned 100 Japanese soldiers into human torches and saved my squad, and have been trying to figure out what that means for the last 80 years. I'm 99 years old now, and I know I don't have much time left. My kids think I'm writing this all down so they'll understand what I went through, have some record of their father's war experience. But that's not really why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I need to say, clearly and without euphemism, that I killed those men, that I did it with fire, that their deaths were as horrible as you can imagine, and probably worse, and that even though I believe I had no choice, even though I'd do it again to save my friends, that doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make me a hero, and it doesn't make them villains. They were soldiers following orders, same as me, and the circumstances of war put us on that beach at that moment, and I had a weapon that could kill them efficiently, and I used it. The thing about war that nobody tells you is that you can do the right thing and the wrong thing at the same time, that you can save lives by taking lives, that you can be a good man who does terrible things and somehow still has to figure out how to live with himself afterward. I saved my squad that night, and I'd do it again, but I'll never stop hearing those screams, never stop seeing those running figures made of fire, never stop knowing that I'm the one who made that happen. And maybe that's the price you pay. Maybe that's what it costs to survive when survival means doing the unthinkable. I don't know. I've had 80 years to think about it, and I still don't know. What I do know is that when I die, probably soon, Tarawa will be one of the last things I think about. Not my wedding day, not the births of my children, not any of the good and normal things I managed to build in the 70-some years after I came home. I'll think about that night on the beach, about the flamethrower in my hands, about the 100 men I burned alive, and about whether any of it meant anything, or if we were all just caught up in something bigger than ourselves that ground us down and spit us out, and moved on without caring what it did to the people who survived it. The battle for Tarawa was considered a strategic victory, a necessary step toward Japan, a costly but important lesson in amphibious assault that saved lives in later operations. That's what the history books say, and maybe it's true. But I can tell you that from where I was standing with 70 pounds of flamethrower on my back and the smell of burning flesh in my nostrils, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the kind of necessary evil that war demands and that decent people have to commit, and then figure out how to live with. And I've been living with it every day since November 1943. My advice, if anyone ever asks, which they don't really, is this. If someone tells you war is glorious or heroic or something to aspire to, they're either lying or they've never actually been there. War is humans at their absolute worst, even when we're trying to be at our best. And the tools we use to fight it, weapons like flamethrowers, are instruments of horror that we've convinced ourselves are necessary. Maybe they are. I don't know. I used one. I know what it can do, I know what I did with it, and I know that necessary and right aren't always the same thing. That night at Tarawa changed me in ways I'm still discovering, even now at the end of my life. It taught me that I'm capable of things I never wanted to believe I could do, that survival can cost more than death, and that some memories don't fade no matter how much time passes, or how much you want them to. When I close my eyes at night, sometimes I'm back on that beach, 19 years old and terrified, and holding a weapon that shoots fire, watching men burn because I made it happen, and knowing that I'd do it all again because the alternative was death for me and everyone I cared about. And that's the choice war gives you. Be a monster or die, and somehow find a way to live with whichever one you choose. I've lived with my choice for 80 years. Some days that feels like punishment. Other days it feels like I got off easy compared to the men who died. And most days it just feels like carrying a weight that I can't put down and don't deserve to forget. That's what war is in the end. Not glory or honor or any of the words we use to make it palatable. It's weight and trauma and memories that burn themselves into you as surely as napalm burns into flesh, and there's no medal or thank you or welcome home parade that can make that okay. You just carry it day after day, year after year, until finally you're so old that the weight has become part of you, and you can't imagine what life would feel like without it. And maybe that's the real cost of Tarawa, or of any battle in any war. Not just the men who died there, though God knows there were enough of them, but the men who survived and had to figure out how to be human again after doing inhuman things for reasons that seemed good at the time and still seem good now, but don't feel good and never will. I saved my squad with that flamethrower. I also burned 100 men alive. Both things are true, and I'll die with both things being true. And I hope that somewhere, somehow, the men I killed understand that I didn't hate them, didn't want to do it, but did it anyway because war doesn't care about want, only about what has to be done. That's my story. That's what happened at Tarawa when 100 Japanese troops charged my position and I turned their Banzai attack into an Inferno. I was 19 years old. I was terrified. I did my job. I survived. And I've been trying to make peace with that ever since, knowing I never really will and probably don't deserve to. War is horror. Flamethrowers are horror. And I was the man holding one on a night when horror was the only thing standing between my friends and death. Make of that what you will. I've spent most of my life trying to figure it out, and I still don't have an answer that satisfies me. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe that's the point.